How good the sound is here. Looks like we do have to get pretty close to the mic. Shoot, I didn't want to do that. I'm Rick Marolt. This is Rob Streiffer. We'll introduce ourselves a little bit more formally in a little bit, but first thing I want to say is the most important thing to know about tonight is that this event is not a debate. If it were a debate, then it'd run the risk of being kind of lopsided, and I would have to set and manage your expectations more carefully than I'm going to. I would have to let you know that Professor Rob Streiffer here is well-known, well-respected, very accomplished tenured professor in bioethics who spends his life doing the bioethics in an academic way and also practicing as member of two animal research oversight committees. Such that last week I'm driving home from work and I hear a familiar voice on the radio and I go, oh boy, I know that voice. It's Rob Streiffer being interviewed by National Public Radio. Whereas I am just a soft-hearted guy who on a very part-time basis has been trying to work for the last few years to end or reduce some experiments on non-human animals at UW-Madison. But since this is not a debate, I don't have to tell you all that and set your expectations that way. What I have to do is tell you what this event really is. It's an experiment. It's an experiment to see if in this kind of format where two of us just get together and talk and have a conversation in public, which I think is not at all natural for either one of us, can contribute to the public discussion of some really important issues. And I think it's also an experiment to see if anything that we share can get past people's natural tendency to take in only the information that confirms the beliefs they already have, what we call biased interpretation or confirmation bias. And we're hoping that something we say, from whatever perspective, can get past the confirmation bias filters and maybe help people see something in a new way and learn something new. A few years ago, Stephen Levitt, the economist behind the team that co-wrote Freakonomics, a book that was all the rage for a while, was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. And the guy who wrote about him in the little blurb in Time was Malcolm Gladwell. And Gladwell described a debate that he had, public debate he had with Stephen Levitt. And he had this to say about it. Halfway through, I glanced over at Levitt and had a realization that I'm not sure I've ever had before with an intellectual opponent. That if I made my case persuasively and cogently enough, he would change his mind. He was, in other words, listening. I read that probably 6 years ago, and it's been in my mind ever since as the model of listening. And this is not a debate, but we're probably going to have some disagreement and view things in different ways. And you will view things in different ways. But I think what a wonderful compliment that is, and how great it would be if we all could listen that well. My mind is open to hearing something new tonight and learning something new. I don't think my deepest held convictions are open to change tonight, but I'm here to learn something new and explore, and I hope you are too. I hope that we can all listen like Stephen Levitt did. So our focus for tonight is a simple question, simple on the surface. How should we decide if or when experiments on non-human animals are ethical? If or when, under what circumstances? The approach we're going to take is to review some commonly used frameworks for making ethical decisions and try to test their applicability to the issue of experiments on non-human animals. We might agree on some things, like I said, we may disagree, but our objective here is an argument, it is not debate, it's exploration. So I ask you to keep that word in mind. We're here to explore. After we've talked for a while, we're going to ask you for your comments and your questions, and then also ask you to participate with the spirit of exploration and focused on that question. How should we decide if or when experiments on non-human animals are ethical? And please note that a spirit of exploration doesn't mean we can't challenge each other a little bit. We want to challenge each other and try to go deep. Wittgenstein, old Austrian philosopher, wrote that the proper method of philosophy is to say only the things that allow themselves to be expressed. And he said that ethics does not allow itself to be expressed. In other words, according to Wittgenstein, there's nothing we can say about ethics. But we're going to try anyway and hope that it's worthwhile. So Rob, would you please introduce yourself?
Not as tall as you are. Hi, so I'm Robert Streiffer. I just want to second Rick's very eloquent remarks there. Even though he's a soft-hearted non-academic, he can apparently quote Wittgenstein with the best of them. That's not usual. This is definitely intended to be a discussion. We'll be looking at lots of different things from different perspectives, and I think it's very worthwhile to explore different perspectives even when we don't necessarily agree with them, because there's probably somebody in the audience who does hold something similar to that view, and it's helpful for them to think about the implications of their own frameworks for these things. I think with that we can just get started.
Can you say a little bit more about your academic background and specialties?
Sure. So my disciplinary training is philosophy. I got my PhD from MIT in 1999, not too long ago, but a while ago, and started here at UW that same year. Looked at ethics of modern biotechnology in general, and have shifted now to looking at the application of biotechnology to non-human animals, primarily as my research focus, and as a sort of prerequisite to that, trying to understand the issues of animal use in general, so that I can better think about the application of biotech to them. As you mentioned, I've served on a few of the oversight committees here at UW. So I've served on the Letters and Sciences Animal Care and Use Committee that oversees animal research taking place within Letters and Sciences. And then I'm also a member of what's referred to as the All-Campus Committee, and this sets campus-wide policy for the animal program here at UW. So I know a little bit about the book literature, but I also know a little bit about how things work in the actual day-to-day operations of the regulatory system.
So just a little bit more about me. Let's make this about me as much as possible. The thing I've done most in recent years is to teach college business courses, including at UW-Madison. I'm a lecturer at UW-Madison, the business school right now. I've taught at other schools too. Do some contract work in information technology, other things. I'm a part-time professional photographer, and I've written a couple books, some nonfiction, some creative writing. I have a bachelor's degree from Carleton College, a master's degree from Princeton University, and an MBA from UW-Madison. And my involvement in this whole issue goes back to 2004, when I started working to, really with the ultimate goal of ending experiments on monkeys. 2,000 monkeys are kept in cages at UW-Madison. Experiments are done on them. We may talk about that tonight. But that's been my focus in this part of my life for the last 8 or 9 years. So let's talk about ethical decision making. And Rob, I thought we'd start with a framework of utilitarianism, because the most common claim of that research on non-human animals is ethical relies on a utilitarian basis. So I thought we might start by defining utilitarianism and then seeing if we can apply it to a specific experiment and figure out how that experiment stacks up and how do we decide and can we tell, and just see where the conversation goes. So utilitarianism is about costs and benefits, and different formulations are that the most ethical action in utilitarianism is the one that maximizes the ratio of benefits to costs for all the relevant stakeholders, or that provides the greatest good for the greatest number. But you can probably do a better job with definitions of these things than I can. Can you say more to define it for us?
Sure, that's certainly in the right ballpark. And there are lots of different flavors of utilitarianism, or more broadly speaking, what's referred to as consequentialism, which says that the right action is the one that has the best overall consequences. Utilitarianism in its classical form is, as you say, it's a theory that says that you're morally required to do that which is going to have the best outcome with respect to maximizing utility, where utility is the word that the classical utilitarians use for sort of individual well-being. And so according to classical utilitarianism, what you're morally required to do in every situation is try to choose that action of the options that are open to you that maximizes the overall balance of positive well-being over negative well-being, benefits over harms. This is certainly the most common kind of justification that's given for animal research. And it's not uncommon for the researchers who do try to engage with the explicit ethics of what they do to say that they adopt a utilitarian framework, and that because they think that animal research in general or a particular protocol is sort of the best way to maximize the common good, that's why what they do is justified. And the language that you were saying earlier about our question that we're addressing about if and when is it ethical, I mean, the utilitarian defense would actually conclude with a stronger conclusion that not only is it ethical, where that just sort of means it's not wrong, it's okay to do, but that it's actually morally required, or at least morally laudatory. And if you talk to animal researchers on campus, I mean, they think that what they're doing is a noble part of the scientific enterprise, and it's going to improve the world in the ways that they think it is. And I mean, for them, the challenge is even sort of stopping to think, well, maybe there's anything wrong with what I'm doing or anything problematic about what I'm doing, when they see it as, you know, their way to make the world a better place, and they're fulfilling that duty and obligation. One important aspect of utilitarianism is that it allows interpersonal trade-offs to justify an action. So on a utilitarian framework, harm to one individual, if that's the only way to bring about a greater benefit to another individual, then according to the utilitarian, that's not only justified, but in fact required. And it's very different from the way we normally think about interpersonal ethics when it comes to people, but many people do think it's the right way to think about our ethical obligations when it comes to animals.
So let's explore that a little bit, because to me it seems odd. When we're talking about research on non-human animals, we stand to get the benefits of it. Now, we can quibble. There may be some smaller benefits to the animals themselves, or to husbandry, or to living conditions. We talk about that occasionally. But primarily the purpose of experimenting on monkeys at Madison is because we hope it's going to benefit people at some point.
Yeah, that's the primary purpose.
Right. So it seems odd to me, in a strange way of thinking about morality, that we do something that intentionally causes harm to others, and sometimes kills them, results in their deaths, because members of our group stand to benefit from it, at least potentially. And yet that's a utilitarian approach. If we knew in a utilitarian framework that a lot of people, if we had high confidence that a lot of people would benefit from relatively small harms to non-human animals, we'd have a moral obligation to cause that harm so that our group would get the benefits. Is that right?
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be our group. So, for example, I mean, this goes back to the qualifications that you mentioned. So we have veterinary research that takes place on campus where the benefits are to other animals of the same species. Some of that's clinical research, so taking place in the vet school where the actual animals who are the subjects of research might also benefit from a new experimental method. So it doesn't always have to be humans versus animals. We also do a lot of environmental and field research where we're looking at ways to protect the environment. Hopefully that will benefit to us eventually, but that's not sort of the proximate goal. But those exceptions aside, the thought is, in the minds of those who adopt a utilitarian justification for their work, is that the benefits to people are substantial. And when the harms to the animals are small enough and the numbers of animals are small enough, and we have a sufficient degree of confidence that the research with animals is going to yield the benefits in question, and all those are things that we should talk about more. But right, when those circumstances are met, when those conditions are met, then it's the right thing to do. And to do otherwise, sort of playing devil's advocate here for the utilitarian, because I'm not actually a utilitarian, but to do otherwise would basically be saying that the interests of a smaller number and a smaller degree of harm is more important from a moral perspective than all of these people lined up who will be helped. And that seems to some people inegalitarian. So the most famous or perhaps infamous, depending on your view, utilitarian who's talked about animal research is Peter Singer. And he argues that the proper understanding of equality and the egalitarian ideals that most of us in this room probably hold dear commits us to thinking that the utilitarian way of thinking about things is right, because to do otherwise would be to essentially discriminate against those individuals who could benefit to a greater degree.
I think, as you pointed out already, this isn't how we make similar decisions about people. Now, in society, we make a lot of decisions that seem to be made on a utilitarian basis. But if we look for the same kind of, we try to conduct the same kind of experiments on people that we conduct on non-human animals, I don't think we'd ever make a utilitarian justification for it. We want to talk about a specific study in a little bit, perhaps. But an experiment that requires, say, a person to be confined in a cage from birth and given a disease or made to suffer brain damage or being on a restricted diet for the individual's whole life, that probably leaves him feeling hungry or her feeling hungry for his or her whole life. Even if we were really confident that that research might benefit or would benefit, will benefit a lot more people, and that the benefits would far outweigh the costs, we don't make that kind of decision on a utilitarian basis. Is that right?
Right.
So what are we to make of claims that the utilitarian framework is the right one to use to justify non-human animals? We've heard that locally, but certainly nationally, internationally, this is a common claim. And it seems to me that it's kind of a self-serving claim, and it's not completely intellectually consistent for people to say utilitarianism is the framework we use when non-human animals are in play, but it doesn't make sense for people. Is that intellectual inconsistency, or am I missing some nuance about utilitarianism?
Well, I don't know that whether it's right or wrong, correct or incorrect, I think is something we need to talk about. I don't sense any inconsistency. And in fact, most people do agree that different moral frameworks are appropriate for different kinds of individuals, even when they disagree about how exactly to classify those different groups of individuals. At the extreme, for example, I take it everybody should agree that what Immanuel Kant referred to as sort of mere things, so this table, for example, this glass of water, they don't have any intrinsic value. We can treat them in pretty much any way that we want, consistent with satisfying whatever obligations we have to others. There's no inconsistency in saying that that's true of this water bottle, but that doesn't mean it's true of me. You have to follow up and start looking at, well, what then justifies the distinction between the kind of consideration we give to these things and the kind of consideration that we give to each other. And it's not, I don't think it's fair to say it's self-serving, at least not in the strict sense, because many of the research endeavors that are ongoing have very little potential benefit apart from they're part of the individual's career for that very individual. So the individual who's studying Parkinson's disease, for example, probably doesn't himself or herself actually have Parkinson's disease. They're trying to help others. In some cases, they're animals, as in the veterinary research. In some cases, they're humans. In some cases, they're both, where the research might have general applicability. But I don't see any reason to call that self-serving, assuming that they're doing it out of a genuine, sincere attempt to improve the lives of others, any more than it's self-serving for a doctor to treat a patient. Yes, they make their money off of that, and if there's a conflict of interest, that needs to be managed and those kinds of things. But absent sort of specific reasons for thinking that something nefarious is going on, I don't see why it's justified to say it's self-serving.
Well, a cynic would say, or perhaps not a cynic, but just a well-informed person.
A realist.
A realist might say, well, let's be direct. The researchers themselves do stand to gain from research. They bring in money, they get to establish labs, they hire staff,
Sure.
They get a chance to publish papers and develop a professional reputation and get tenure and get promotions. Right. And so there is some self-interest at stake.
Sure.
They can also be altruistic, and they're in it to serve others, but then it's group interest. And in my own personal moral scale, group interest is only slightly better than self-interest and selfishness, because I like to think more broadly that we don't pick ourselves or our own kind to be superior to others, but we are more egalitarian. So that's where my vocabulary comes from there. But why don't we, so what would justify a different framework?
Well, can I press you on that?
No, I think we
issue?
should just keep going.
I mean, this strikes me as an odd view, and you can clarify and explain why it's not odd. I mean, so if I devote a lot of my time to helping the poor of the United States, I mean, all of a sudden this turns into something that's only marginally better than being selfish because it's within my group. If I help individuals within my family, this is only marginally better than selfish activity because they're related to me. I mean, these are altruistic, noble, right, laudatory things, at least is the way I think of them. So I'm
Well, one reason I say that is because in the context of research on non-human animals, there's another group, there's the other group whom we harm to serve ours.
Right.
So I think that opposition is meaningful.
Okay.
It's not just altruistic, but it's also harming
Right.
of some group. And the other reason I say it is not because I don't think we should care for our family members or for people who are like us or for fellow citizens, but I think there is, I think we draw too sharp distinctions among races, genders, families, nationalities, and that also leads us sometimes to cause others harm who don't fit into our group.
Right.
And so I like to go back to the ideas of people like Albert Einstein and Albert Schweitzer. We talked about widening our circles of compassion. I look for the widest possible circles of compassion and not these sharp distinctions that cause some people to be outsiders and then potentially harmed.
But when there are conflicts of interest among people within, or individuals within those circles of compassion, then, I mean, somebody's got to bear the burden and somebody's got to get the benefit, or else the benefits will be foregone. So you're absolutely right that in most circumstances where we think about how to treat people ethically who are not necessarily in our group, however we think of that, we're usually thinking about devoting sort of more energy to the people within the group, leaving the people outside the group to sort of fend for themselves and those kinds of things. We're not usually thinking about actively causing them harm.
Right.
And I agree that that's an important difference. Yeah.
It's important that you agree with me.
Okay.
So the more you do that, the better the evening is going to go around.
So back so back to your point that you know, the people who want to adopt a utilitarian framework for thinking about our ethics to animals, many of them, Singer aside, would not adopt that same framework for humans. And you're right that the more thorough, explicit justification for animal research actually has sort of two parts. And so I'm thinking here of a classic article that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine many years ago by Carl Cohen, who's one of the philosophers who sort of defends most of the status quo with respect to our use of animals. Everybody agrees that it could be cleaned up. The current ways in which we use animals could be cleaned up in a variety of ways, but he's largely defending the status quo there. And his argument has sort of two parts. One says, well, there can't be any rights-based objections to the use of animals in research because, argument to follow, animals don't have rights. So all that's left then are utilitarian ways of evaluating the research. And then he does the utilitarian calculation in such a way that he's quite confident that the benefits justify the research. So it actually has sort of two parts. First, you know, animals don't have rights. And then the second part is the invocation of the utilitarian framework. Because many people at least think that it's implausible to say we don't have any duties here, right? That animals are truly the moral equivalent of, say, this bottle of water, and we can treat them in any way we want. Having worked in the research oversight side of things, perhaps people harbor that in secret, but I've never heard anybody actually, put that forward saying we can treat these animals however we want. They all acknowledge that we have a variety of
Yeah,
obligations, and that's a question.
Some duty, yeah.
Yeah.
So they don't have rights per se. So I'd like to come back to the whole rights issue.
Okay.
But while we're on utilitarianism, I'd like to bring in a specific experiment, and we can talk about how utilitarianism might be applied in practice. How do we decide if, say, a specific experiment is actually ethical. If you don't mind, I'd like to suggest we talk about one that's gotten some attention in the community lately that involves maternal deprivation, which means that newborn monkeys are taken from their mothers immediately after birth. I want to maybe start summarizing that article, the protocol, the experiment a little bit, and then ask you to fill in some details. My understanding is the researchers are interested in developing an anxious personality. And so they want to create adverse conditions for newborn monkeys early in their lives that will develop trait-based anxiety, personality-based anxiety, and anxious disposition. And so they take the newborn monkeys from their mothers immediately after birth. They put them for the first 3 to 5 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks of their lives with what's called a surrogate, which is essentially a stuffed animal, serving as a stuffed doll of some kind, a replacement for the mother.
The surrogate is, I think, going to be slightly different. I'm not sure if they actually exist yet, so I don't know exactly the details of what they are going to have. But it's going to be cloth covered, and it will be mounted in such a way that it can rock back and forth, which past research has shown helps the infants develop.
And apparently the newborns are attracted, and they cling to these surrogate mothers, and they develop, or the claim is they actually experience what's called contact comfort in a way that they would from their natural mothers. And then, but they don't have interaction with other monkeys for the
during those 4 weeks.
4 weeks. And then they're placed in a cage with a peer.
Right.
And so this research is called peer raising, peer rearing, right? And then a little bit later, they're placed into a colony, I think. No?
So they'll spend the rest of the time with their peer in a double cage or in a cage with the peer only.
Okay. I think later on the peers are replaced. I think they do spend some time in the colony. I looked at this today. But then later on, they're placed with a different cage mate who also has come from the program to develop anxious dispositions. And the researchers want to see how those two monkeys with anxious dispositions interact. But in any case, and then throughout this time, they undergo some blood draws, some PET scans, some MRI scans, and something called a CSF tap.
The spinal tap.
Spinal tap to get some fluid, cortisol, measuring stress or something from the spinal area, right?
Right.
And then, well, before I get to the end point, would you like to share any more details to fill in the gaps here?
I mean, what you said is, I think, pretty right, although I think they stay with the same peer for a while. The purpose of introducing the peer into the rearing environment is just because a lot of the social needs of the animals, which now can't be met by the mom because they don't have their mom anymore, nonetheless can be to a certain extent satisfied by raising in a social situation with other individuals. And in this case, I think it's important that for the purposes of the research and in terms of thinking about the development of the animals, it's important that they be placed with another animal who's also been peer-reared, because if you try to mix the peer-reared animals with animals who've been raised in a more normal social environment, they actually don't work out very well because the peers don't know how to behave in a normal social environment. So the two peer-reared animals can get along better than one peer-reared, one maternally reared animal. So that's the reason for doing that. And then the reason why you introduce the peer to begin with is to help mitigate the more extreme consequences of not having access to mom. So the peer rearing can help in some of those aspects. But that all said...
I have to say quickly, now that I see it in front of me, I agree with you.
Okay, good.
Okay.
With that being said, the intent is to create an anxious phenotype. So these animals are supposed to deal less well with anxiety than normal. They are supposed to experience more anxiety. And if they didn't do that to a sufficient degree, then the research wouldn't be achieving whatever goals it has, which we haven't really talked about yet.
No, we haven't.
Yeah.
So the goals are to develop this anxious phenotype, which is,
Well, that's the means.
that's the means.
Yeah.
What are the goals?
There are several, and if you'll forgive me, I think I can do best just by sort of trying to summarize what the PI has said, because part of the review process of the protocol requires that the PI say what the justification is for the research, so it can be reviewed by the oversight committees. So here's some language, and stop me if I'm going on too long. But so the PI in this case says that these efforts will allow us to identify the exact brain regions affected in these early anxious phenotypes, the changes in gene function in these regions, and the specific genes that are involved in increasing the early risk to develop anxiety and depression. So they're both looking at the changes that anxiety cause, but also what the genetic bases are that make an individual more or less disposed to have an anxious temperament are. Such information has the potential, no guarantees, but potential, to identify new targets in specific brain regions that can lead to new ideas about treatment and even prevention of the long-term suffering associated with early adversity.
So, excuse me, we want to evaluate a study like this with a utilitarian framework. Mm-hmm. So we need an accounting of, at some level, of costs and benefits, harms and benefits. So I wonder if we can identify some of the harms to the monkey or other costs. For example, there are costs in dollars used for the research, right? So that's a cost. Harms to the monkey include confinement, whatever the psychological distress is associated with having an anxious disposition, some physical discomfort or pain or from the blood draws and scans and spinal tap.
So those will generally be, the scans are going to be done under anesthesia, and I don't know that they would experience any pain. They might experience some distress from the disorienting effects of anesthesia, just like you or I might if we're waking up. The blood draws, going to be blood draws, so there'll be some discomfort, but not long lasting. The spinal tap is also going to be done under anesthesia, and there'll be analgesia provided, pain relief provided afterwards that I expect will help. I've never had a spinal tap, but my wife has. It doesn't look like it's a lot of fun if you're awake when it happens. They're not going to be awake, but I would expect that there's going to be some residual discomfort. How much is a little bit hard to know, given that they are going to be receiving pain relief. You also didn't mention that there are a variety of behavioral tests that are going to be done on the monkeys, basically trying to assess the degree to which the monkeys exhibit an anxious phenotype. So, for example, they'll do what's referred to as a human intruder test, where the monkey's in its cage, the human comes in, makes eye contact with the monkey, which is perceived as threatening by monkeys, and so they will then react with some degree of fear, and then they measure sort of how much does it react to the presence of the human, and the more reaction, presumably the greater degree of anxiety. They also do a test involving a snake, where the snake is in a plexiglass box, so no actual danger, but the monkey has an innate fear of the snake. And you put a variety of treats on top of the plexiglass box that the monkey likes, and then you wait and see how long does it take the monkey to get over its fear of the snake and go for the treat. And then the longer it takes to get over its fear, it's assumed that the greater degree of anxiety that it was experiencing. So there's going to be some degree of discomfort with those kinds of tests. Most of them are relatively short. In the snake example, the monkey doesn't even have to get the treat if it doesn't want to. So I think the very fact that it's willing to go for the treat is actually evidence that it's not a huge problem from a welfare perspective.
And the biggest harm, perhaps, that the monkey experiences is that after 60 or 70 weeks, a little over 1 year, the monkey is killed, so that the researchers can examine the brain tissue. Right.
They're looking for molecular analyses there in terms of the brain tissue to look at, stuff that's beyond me.
So,
you said that's the biggest harm. I mean, it's worth stopping over that claim. I think on any reasonable view, the intentional death of a monkey is going to be a big ethical problem that isn't going to be in need of justification. But there are people, and I would go so far as to say it's pretty common in how people think about animals that death probably isn't the greatest harm. So if you have an animal, for example, that is suffering from extreme physical pain that can't be relieved, or at least isn't going to be relieved given the cost it's going to take to relieve it, many people would say that in those circumstances, euthanasia, in fact, is preferable to continued suffering, even though that is going to be the death of the animal. So I think it's not uncommon to have the view that actually, while nobody takes the death of a monkey as insignificant, nonetheless, suffering is actually a greater concern.
Potentially suffering, there's a lot of suffering going on, we don't want that to continue.
Right.
The monkey also gives up life,
Right.
gives up a natural life. Just being in a lab gives up
wouldn't have had a natural life anyway.
Wouldn't have had natural life anyway. So suffers the harms of being in an artificial environment. And sometimes in this research, the monkeys could be housed singly, which I understand is stressful for monkeys. But
During the first 3 weeks. After that, they'll be
well, there's no
pair
protocol
housed.
that says, if necessary, if they're not getting along with cage
Yes,
mates,
that's a
we'll house them
standard,
standard
yes.
language. But at most, they'd be housed with one other cage mate,
Right.
whereas monkeys in the wild live in colonies and they're more social. So it's nothing close to a natural life. But we could also try to determine, is there any utility, happiness, enjoyment, pleasure in a monkey continuing a life in the lab that he or she would forego because he or she was killed after 60 or 70 weeks.
Right.
So that could be a consideration. Now, so those are some of the harms, and we're trying to do something with harms and benefits, costs and benefits here to see if a utilitarian framework helps us determine how ethical this experiment is.
Could I add to that list, though?
Please.
So, I mean, we are thinking, and we do usually focus on harms as being the most salient ethical downside of research. But there is also sort of the loss of a variety of benefits, even if we don't call those harms. So one of the things that I think is relevant to evaluating the well-being of the animals in this study is not just the harms, but also the lack of positive aspects of the maternal-infant relationship, that the infant would have actually gotten some pleasure and joy from. This animal's not going to have that.
And perhaps the mother suffers also from having her newborn taken away.
Right.
Right? So how about benefits? We've agreed not to talk about how decisions are made and oversight committee processes. We want to talk about how we should make decisions, how we determine whether or not an experiment is ethical or under what circumstances it might be ethical. But you're actually on a committee and a panel, and you participate in these discussions, and we're told that there's a weighing of costs and benefits, and that's why research is approved. So what kind of benefits are cited that would help justify this experiment on a utilitarian basis?
So in the first instance, the justification is given in terms of the knowledge that they expect or hope to gain. So it's not benefits per se, right? But it's information about the organisms in question that we hope will help us better treat humans in the future.
So I think it's a real important point to say it's not benefits per se.
In the first instance.
In the first instance.
Right.
It may ultimately lead to some benefits, but the first thing is that some researchers or a community of researchers gains some knowledge.
Right.
Right? Which doesn't, in my view, it's not a very significant benefit.
If all it was knowledge, and people were confident that there was no reasonable chance that this was going to actually translate into anything that helped anybody lead a better life, then I think that while there can be significant kinds of knowledge, so I think about space exploration, for example. We spend a fair bit of money on that, not because, it has all kinds of ancillary benefits, but as a sort of stock example. There is all kinds of knowledge I think it's worth spending money on. But when it comes to actually harming and killing animals, then I think the threshold goes dramatically up. And so there, if it really were just knowledge totally unrelated to anything practical, then I think most people would agree that that's not going to justify causing harm and death to, especially not monkeys.
So what can we say at this point with an experiment like this, and at the point of approval, about benefits to help us make a utilitarian case if we wanted to?
So you look at the knowledge that they're trying to get, you ask whether or not the study is well designed to yield that knowledge, and then you ask how important is that knowledge to the clinical condition that we hope to treat. And there's no magic algorithm here. You just have a bunch of people from a variety of perspectives thinking about it, looking at it, mulling it over. People who are more familiar with the model and so have some experience, people who are bringing in an outside perspective. So the membership on the committees looks at these things from a variety of different viewpoints. And then that's what you have to go on. In some cases, you can bring in outside people to consult if it's felt that that's necessary. I don't think we've done that on either on the committee that I've been on, because we've usually felt that we had enough expertise to make that judgment. But I mean, that's, I think, what you would do. So you would look at how important is the condition, how important is the knowledge to understanding and hopefully eventually being able to better treat that condition, and then how likely do we think this particular protocol is in terms of being able to actually yield that knowledge.
So as you know, it's a long-standing criticism of mine that at the point of making, approving a protocol, approving an experiment, there's really nothing. There's really nothing, or very little known about benefits. And it seems to me that people have a hope, an intuition, a belief. We have all these known harms. We don't have known benefits. And yet we say there's a utilitarian case for going forward with this experiment. That troubles me.
I think that the animal scientists on the committees would say that they've got a lot of experience that suggests that this kind of thing can help improve the human condition. And you know, they have their confidence. Maybe it's misplaced. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor, but certainly I don't think anybody, well, I won't try to speak for the committee or anybody else on the committee, but I didn't have any doubt that this was trying to answer an important scientific question, and I trusted the other people in the committee that this was, you know, pretty well vetted science in order to do that. Yeah. But in the end, right, and even the passage that I quoted from the PI, I mean, it's about the potential benefits. There are no guarantees. It's research, it's exploratory, it's experimental. We could get to the end of this and not have learned anything, but I think that everybody would agree that, well, that was tragic. That doesn't necessarily mean that the wrong decision was made at the beginning, because it might have been a reasonable assumption to begin with. But if it doesn't work out, then that would be then a protocol that the justification eventually did not yield anything.
I have to tear down the fourth wall here and speak to the audience directly,
Sure.
Just like on Scrubs. Rob and I have also agreed not to get into what the philosophers call the empirical question about animal research. There's this theory we're talking about, ethical frameworks, but there is a big question: how much do people benefit from experiments on non-human animals? And that's a debate unto itself. Theoretically, it's not a theoretical question, as Yogi Berra said. In theory and practice are two different things, but in practice, not really, something like that. But that question should be able to be answered. We should be able to say how much do people benefit, and how predictive is research on human animals for human disease and human response to drugs. But we're not scientists, we're not experts, and we didn't think it was a worthwhile use of our time to try to dance around that issue. So there is an empirical question here.
And it is important,
and it's
from
important
the utilitarian
perspective. And we can't answer it tonight.
Well, if I can make another further comment about the utilitarian framework, though, because as we both said, it's very common In fact, I would say it's the most common justification given for animal research. And people who support animal research typically will explicitly say, at least with respect to animals, I am a utilitarian. I think it's worth pointing out that what they mean by utilitarianism is actually, I think, sort of somewhat different from how we've defined it and how it's defined in the ethics literature. So according to utilitarianism, where what you're required to do is to maximize utility of all the options open to you, there is no room, no ethical room, for what philosophers call options or what they call constraints. So an option is, you would have an option to do something if you had circumstances such that it was morally okay for you to do something other than maximize utility. Okay? So for a utilitarian, there are no options because you're always required to maximize utility. There are also no constraints on what you can do to maximize utility. Whereas many other people and many other ethical viewpoints would say that there are in fact both options and constraints. So there are rights-based constraints, for example, when thinking about interpersonal relations with humans that prevent you from ethically maximizing utility when other people are involved. But we also have options. So right now, as wonderful and laudatory as this event is, I think, it's unlikely to literally be the one and only action that will make the world as good a place as possible of all the different actions that I had open to me. So, but I think what I'm doing is okay. But according to the utilitarian, actually it's not. I'm foregoing an opportunity to make the world an even better place.
Sorry.
So it's a very stringent theory, and I would suggest that even most people who say they're utilitarians about animals don't actually think those two things hold when it comes to animals. So for the research to be justified, according to the view that I think most supporters of research hold, it has to meet a threshold of scientific validity and significance and those kinds of things. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the one and only research study that will maximize utility. Similarly with constraints. So for example, I think when people reflect on their ethical obligations to their pets, for example, who are, of course, animals often of the same species as are used in research, they're going to think there are constraints on how you can treat that animal, even in the pursuit of making the world as good a place as possible.
So how many thoroughgoing, principled utilitarians are there?
I don't know if there are any. There are two who profess to be. Singer and Richard Frey, who recently passed away. But even there, I'm not sure that if push comes to shove, they would be willing to abide by those implications across the board.
Because they're pretty harsh implications.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So when we talk about a consequentialist justification for this, really we're talking about something that's much weaker than classical utilitarianism. It's that the good here is good enough to justify the harms. But it doesn't necessarily meet this very high threshold of maximizing utility.
We've gone on a long time on utilitarianism, and I thought we'd wrap up by 8 o'clock to give the audience a discussion half hour. So, Rob, take your pick. We could talk about deontology, moral status.
Let's talk about moral status.
Let's talk about moral status.
Although it relates to deontology, or it will.
So first, it will. So maybe a quick definition of deontology. My understanding is deontology is kind of a family of approaches to these issues. Deontology, the word itself, is based on the Greek root for duty. And one of the ideas is that we have a duty to others, perhaps a duty to respect their rights or to treat them with fairness or with respect, or to follow certain rules in our treatment of them. So where utilitarianism is consequence-based, an action is ethical when its consequences are benefits that maximize the ratio of benefits to harms, right? But deontologists are more concerned with the act in and of itself, or Kant was at least, not the consequences of the act. The act itself is ethical or not.
As I would carve up the territory, deontologists do frequently care about the consequences, but they differ from the utilitarian and the consequentialist more generally by not only caring about the consequences. So the individuals who don't care about the consequences at all are what I would refer to as sort of absolutists. So they think there are some things that are wrong, even though the heavens may fall, is the phrase from Kant. And there are a few absolutists out there, but I think they're not the normal deontologist. So the normal deontologist would allow that there might be, for example, rights-based restrictions on how you can treat other individuals in the pursuit of making the world better. But many of them would also agree that those restrictions can, in certain circumstances, be overridden by other considerations. So it's a more moderate view.
And Kant was a famous absolutist who said, for example, lying is always wrong.
Even when...
Lying may save lives.
Yeah.
You can't do it. Lying is always wrong.
Yeah.
Right? So
even
what
lying to the very murderer who's going to kill the child is wrong on his view.
The act in and of itself is unethical. It's difficult to figure out how we should use the little time that we have left here. Why don't we do this? I'd like to share my views about the maternal deprivation experiment and ask if you're willing to share some of your thoughts on it. There's plenty more we could get into in virtue ethics and moral status and rules and deontology, and I have at least 3 or 4 more quotes from Wittgenstein that I'm eager to use. Let me tell you how I process, from my worldview, an experiment like Kalin's. Obviously, I'm opposed to it. And I recognize that we have these moral intuitions, and I'm aware of moral intuitions within myself that I then go through some rationalization process to justify it. And researchers doing brain scans claim they have actually shown that we moralize first. We have intuitions first, and we come to moral conclusions first, and then after that, we think about it, and we rationalize, we justify our moral intuitions. And I'm aware that I do that sometimes. So I have this moral intuition that the experiment that we just talked about is wrong. It's immoral, it's unethical. Then I think about it, and then I question my intuition. And some of the thoughts that come to mind are probably not strictly deontological or don't follow a framework exactly. But the way I process it, maybe 4 or 5 key points. I think living matters. I think depriving a monkey of a natural life, or even some opportunity of enjoyment and pleasure and utility and happiness in a lab is wrong, because living matters. I don't want to deprive anyone, including a monkey, of an opportunity to flourish, to have a life. I'm sympathetic to Albert Schweitzer's idea that all living things are worthy of reverence. I think suffering matters. I don't want to cause suffering to anyone else, even if I stand to benefit from it. I feel some empathy. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about animals in labs, and I think I feel some of that suffering. And I don't like it. I don't like it at all. Actually, a few years before I even got involved in this issue, I wrote to a friend of mine that I am a Harlow monkey, because I go through life with some anxiety. And now we're back to creating anxiety and mental, some emotional distress in monkeys in the labs. And I think I feel that. I don't want to cause that to anybody else, even if hypothetically I could benefit from it sometime. I have this intuition, or just a personal rule, that it's just wrong to make others suffer so that I could benefit from it. It just feels extremely wrong to me. I don't find the species boundary morally significant. That's wrapped up in some of our discussion, but we didn't make it explicit. Why we could say that utilitarianism is a good framework for experimenting, for justifying experiments on non-human animals, but it's not necessarily the framework we'd use for decisions about people. Someplace in there is the assumption that the difference in species is morally significant, that just because we're people, they're monkeys, that matters. I don't find that to be, I don't feel that. I don't intuit that. And now, you guys love to play these, you call them cases. So if you have to choose, Rick, between saving the life of a monkey and saving the life of a person, what would you do? And the honest answer is, I'm pretty sure I'd save the life of the person, but I don't know how I would rationalize that. I don't know how I would justify that morally. I don't know what difference between the person and the monkey would tell me that is really the moral thing to do. I don't know why the species boundary is morally significant. I'm also sensitive to something we didn't get a chance to talk about at all tonight, an issue of social justice. And it seems to me that the way our society uses non-human animals in labs and elsewhere is really an issue of social justice, that we are a powerful majority, and we use our power to treat weaker minorities however we see fit for our gain. And that's an issue of social justice, just like it is with different populations of people. And I don't like it. I don't like social injustice. I'd rather try to maximize social justice than participate in the injustice. And the last thing I'd share from my view is that I've developed over the years kind of I call it the kindergarten rule. I imagine that, I don't have children, but I imagine if I had children and I want to teach them good ethics and good morals, I can't imagine saying to them, now kids, Rover and Purpur are good family members and we care for them deeply and we have to take good care of them and they go on vacations with us and they sleep in our beds. But just remember, if we could benefit, or members of our kind could benefit from having them harmed and killed and experimented on in a lab, that would be a good thing to do. So what a bizarre, confusing message about ethics and morals that is. I would much rather teach my children respect for life, reverence for life, than teach them that using animals in this way is ethical. So that's my closing statement.
Well, on the assumption that the research in question is going to be yielding this important knowledge that will help treat people, I mean, I think that while you're, of course, entitled to raise your kids however, your hypothetical kids however you like, you're especially entitled to raise your hypothetical kids however you like.
All my hypothetical kids are way above average, too. Really
I mean, I think that the challenge to a sort of Schweitzerian view comes when you do have these conflicts of interest. And, I mean, it sounds like you're sort of focusing on one side of the scale and just totally ignoring the other. And, I mean, we don't do that in the case of people. While you're right that we don't treat humans in human subject research in ways that we often treat animals, and we don't think that would be ethically appropriate, we do expose human beings to risk for the benefit of others, usually with their consent, but not always. And, I mean, it's not radically different, I don't think. Think about various kinds of research on children. If we were to say we'll never allow research on children because, after all, you can't get consent, at least assuming that the research is going to cause some harm, well, then that essentially dooms children to being in a non-controlled experiment, right, where they're going to be subjected to all the kinds of medications and drugs that have been tested on us, but not on kids. And in the long run, that's a recipe for additional harm to them. So I think that the Schweitzerian view needs to be qualified, and then the question is to what extent does animal research satisfy however the resulting view gets articulated. With respect to Kalen's protocol, so I did vote against this particular protocol. The literature that I was aware of suggested to me pretty strongly that the lives of these animals was going to be quite bad and that they were going to have to forego a lot of the normal, if minimal nonetheless, benefits of an existence in a lab in terms of interacting with their mom and those kinds of things that are important to the infants. Given that, the research had to meet a pretty high threshold in terms of being necessary for producing the knowledge in question, and the knowledge also, having a really good potential to generate lots of human benefit. And while I see the importance of the scientific questions that are being asked, I don't really have any doubt that they're important questions. The translation of knowledge to actual benefit is a very messy endeavor, and I wasn't convinced that it was sufficient in this case. And it wasn't clear to me that there weren't alternative ways of at least approaching those questions even if they probably couldn't answer it exactly or with the degree of scientific certainty that the PI wanted in this case. But nonetheless, there were other less extreme ways of doing research on anxiety that could probably advance this particular area. Maybe not as quickly, but nonetheless do that.
In other words, on this experiment, you agree with me?
Well, I think we're coming from some different perspectives, but in terms of a vote up or down, yeah.
It was a joke.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a joke in there. Good, thanks for sharing that, Rob.
So we're open for discussion?
Comments or questions, but I'd like to say up front, again, that we're here in a spirit of exploration with a focus on how do we decide if and when these experiments are ethical.
And so I'm asking either of you to discuss the introduction that one would read in a scientific paper with respect to this study.
So there's, unfortunately, the PI would probably be the best person to answer that. But, and there is a little bit of information available now online through the UW Animal Research website, I believe, that sort of talks about some of the history here. In this context, I'll try to answer as best I can, but so in this context, the maternal deprivation methodology is something that's been developed and used for many decades. It comes in more and less extreme forms. So if you go back to Harry Harlow's work involving the vertical isolation apparatus, also referred to by Harlow as the well of despair, here you have total isolation, no visual contact, no social contact whatsoever, for sometimes extended periods, up to years. That's sort of one extreme. At the other extreme, you have essentially peer rearing, where the surrogate and the peers take over some aspects of the development of the monkeys, and that's much closer to what this protocol, that's what this protocol is doing. But the similarities between monkeys who've been exposed to these kinds of rearing procedures and the anxiety that they develop is viewed among the scientific community as grounding a pretty useful model. Now that's controversial, and if we were going to talk about the empirical side of things here, other people would have to get up and talk about it. But one of the advantages that the PI touts about this particular model in the protocol is that this will relate to a lot of existing data that's already been done using this kind of model at other places. Does that help at all?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Please.
I'm coming to this rather as a newcomer, but it seems so odd that you need to experiment to figure out what's causing anxiety. I mean, removing a mother will cause anxiety.
It's not about what's causing the anxiety. I'm sorry, I should, go ahead, I'm sorry.
It just seems so like everyone's trying to resolve this on a micro level, whereas on a societal level, we should make it easier for mothers to be at home. I mean, isn't this all very obvious?
Well,
and we haven't been doing this for 40 years.
So the protocol isn't designed to answer the question, should human children be raised with their moms? Right? We do know the answer to that, but that's not what this is answering. So this is looking at a more mechanistic level about what are the changes that early adversity causes, so that when they do happen, against our best advice, but nonetheless when they happen, we might be in a better position to
intervene.
Yeah.
But you raise a point that Rob touched on just briefly in our discussion. And a perfect utilitarian would say, would ask, would it be more ethical for us to take the money and not cause the harm and put our efforts someplace else, such as in programs that help mothers stay home with their children, right? To find the most ethical action, it's not just what's most ethical in the lab at UW-Madison, but it could be something very different.
In this particular case, if Kalin, the PI in this case, had foregone this research, I can pretty much guarantee you that it wouldn't have gone to helping moms stay at home.
Yes.
Right? And so from the PI's perspective and from the committee's perspective, that's not really an option that's on the table. Now, if you're talking about national funding priorities that Congress can set, right? Are we giving too much to the NIH to look at basic research and not enough to other parts of health and human services to help moms? That's a perfectly good debate to have, I think. And I don't know that anybody's terribly happy with the way we've divided up the pie, although we might disagree about how to improve it. So that's I think, a perfectly fine consideration. But at least with respect to the sort of individual decisions, these aren't individuals who can just snap their fingers and transfer money from NIH to other services.
There are two. Whose hand was up first back there? Don't know. We'll go in the middle first then.
Okay. Actually, my question is kind of or statement is kind of a follow-up because the last two questions really focus on sort of the scientific method and the process by which the experiment question came up. And I wanted to go back to something you said, Dr. Streiffer, in talking about the costs and benefits. And one of the statements you made was that if this study goes forward and at the end there isn't that transferable information that leads to it, then that would be a failure and a tragedy. And while I agree that would be a tragedy, I don't think that's a failure in science. I think we have to be very careful about how we define the outcome. Just because an experiment results in negative results or not supportive of a hypothesis doesn't mean that's a failure. In fact, that's a tremendous learning opportunity. And there's valuable information that comes from the process and from the results, even if they don't support the hypothesis. I think that's very important to keep that in mind on the cost and benefit equation. There could be benefit.
But it's a, I'm going to give a reaction here. We still have to consider the ethics of an experiment that doesn't produce the desired results. From an ethical perspective, science isn't just always inherently good. Right? Okay, good.
I wasn't disagreeing. My point was, it also isn't inherently bad if you don't get the result you were hoping to get.
So the way I put my claim was slightly, I mean, it was carefully put. So I said if the study ends up being divorced from all practical import, then it will have been a failure. What you're suggesting is that it can have practical import even if it doesn't end up supporting the hypothesis that they're testing. I agree wholeheartedly with that, but that wasn't quite the situation I was imagining. So imagine that they come out and they realize, you know, we really should have set this up differently and we didn't get any useful data. None. Not positive, not negative. That would be a tragedy.
But if that were communicated to other scientists to repeat that same mistake, that would be a benefit.
If it ended up getting out of that loop of only telling other scientists what to do and actually helping people, then yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Right there, please.
Yeah, also kind of a follow-up. The first thing I wanted to say was that, so disclosure, I'm a graduate student in our science program. I work with human subjects, which is an issue that's important to me tangentially, not professionally. But the thing that's most striking to me about this discussion as it pertains to, for example, things that are obvious, is that the whole reason that we do science is that things that are obvious are not necessarily right. There have been tons and tons of views and theories throughout human history that have seemed obvious and made perfect sense but turned out to be incorrect. So the issue isn't whether it's obvious, but whether we know with certainty and, more importantly, mechanistically, what we can do with that information. Even if something is obvious, then understanding the causes for it allows us to do more kind of engineering later in the process that affects translational approaches. And that's true whether the starting thesis was obvious to the layperson or not. So let's just kind of answer that first question. And as kind of a follow-up, I mean, I think that the thing about the empirical question is that it doesn't necessarily have to be one that, I mean, I understand fully why it was left to a different discussion, but I think that there's a disparity in approach there that needs to be addressed at the level of how we rhetorically approach these issues, because there are frameworks that exist to address the empirical question in a way that is consistent with ethical frameworks, and skipping the question is sort of like setting up the debate and then never happening, in my view. I mean, the reason I said, for example, you know, people do work now on the meta-economics of science. For example, saying, you know, when you work on excited states of atoms in a lab because you're physicists and you're curious, and then 30 years later you have a laser, and that improved ophthalmology much more than, you know, translational ophthalmological research ever would have. that the benefits are difficult to quantify unless you look at it in a sufficiently long view. And that role is being taken up now by academics who work on that question. I think the dialogue between ethicists and people who work more stringently on cost-benefit analyses in both the policy framework and the scientific framework needs to be richer. So I guess I mean, I'm not sure if I was aiming at a question per se, but I guess the point that I was making is that most of the time when we have difficulties with these ethical frameworks, it's because we have disagreements and uncertainty. When you say, for example, that the constraints and options aren't the kinds of things that we think about on an average, everyday utilitarian basis, that's just because we are so uncertain about the difference in utility between these two options that we're essentially indifferent toward them. Not because one isn't necessarily better than the other, or because we're content to settle for something that's suboptimal, but because optimal is hard to do. And I mean, not that you don't already know this, you've worked in this field, I understand that. But I think that when we stop guesstimating and start trying to be more rigorous about how we do cost-benefit analysis, and because there are people who are doing that now, working on that question very rigorously, we can start to have a debate that is sort of less rooted solely in philosophy and applies that philosophy on a more practical level.
Are you assuming a utilitarian framework for all the decisions in science?
I think that the way that utilitarianism is presented in the manner that I infer you might be asking that question is a little bit narrow. I myself wouldn't consider myself a classical utilitarianist. If anything, I'm more of a Rawlsian consequentialist. Because I don't think that, for example, it's appropriate to simply subtract one person's welfare at the gain of someone else and call it even. I think that there are ways around that that are instrumental. I generally think of morality instrumentally, not as, you know, what's the best thing to do in this situation.
So if I could jump in, I mean, I think I agree that we would benefit, the discussion would benefit from greater exchange between ethicists and the kind of people who are doing meta-analyses of the utility of research. But that's just one part of the debate. It's not the debate, such that we haven't really touched on anything. We just sort of set the stage for the debate. And there are, of course, lots of arguments that would suggest quite strongly that the results of that analysis aren't going to make the difference that supporters of the research think it's going to make. So the people who think that a cost-benefit, and this goes back to Rick's question about utilitarianism, the people who think that the cost-benefit analysis is the debate, right, are assuming a view about the permissibility of trade-offs between humans and animals, and that's part of what we were discussing today, although it didn't occupy most of our discussion. We should go ahead. Tricia?
I have a question about methodology, and I don't know if either you can answer it, but given, in another world, I used to work with troubled adolescents, and so we have a large end of extremely anxious young human beings. And based on what I know of the methodology, most of the work that's going to be done on the monkeys could actually be done. fMRIs, done on humans all the time, genetic testing done on humans all the time. So I don't know what the last brain analyses that they're planning on doing once they kill the monkeys. But was there consideration in the considerations and in the protocol of how much of this work could have been done comparing anxious young humans, non-anxious young humans, etc., using current technology?
Yes, there's some in the protocol. I don't know that you would find it satisfactory or comprehensive, but there's some discussion in the protocol, both of what advantages this has over human subjects research in terms of controlling the environment and the timing of various procedures on the monkeys in a way that wouldn't be feasible with humans, and so allowing at least a more confident interpretation of the results than you could get from humans. And then, as you mentioned yourself, right, I mean, ultimately they want to do analysis of the brain tissue at a relatively early time point, so they can't wait 60 years for 80 years for the individual to die and get the results that they want. The protocol also addresses a variety of different animal model alternatives that were put forward as at least possibly more humane than the one that was being discussed. But again, you might not find the discussion satisfactory, but they were rejected either as not answering the scientific question that needed to be answered, or in fact as introducing its own kinds of cost to the welfare of animals, and this was actually the more preferable one. The protocol here is kind of striking if people, so there's a redacted version that's available online now, and it's kind of striking because the PI actually says himself that the kind of isolation studies that Harlow did with the Well of Despair, he says flat out, would not be acceptable. So even the PI in question sort of has a point where he says, you know, this is too much to ask of any individual animal. But he thought this was a comparatively mild intervention. I disagreed, but did you want to? Yeah.
Yes, the researchers here at the university do things to non-human primates that they would never do, even if it was legal, I like to think anyway, to human primates. Starve them, mutilate them, kill them. What? I don't know if you can speak for the researchers, maybe you can speak for yourself. What are the primary differences between non-human primates and we humans that allow this sort of justification?
You start with that one, Rick?
Well, we weren't able to get into moral status at all. But Rob, I think you're kind of a specialist in this concept of moral status. And the idea is that we have, what's that?
You're going to put it back on?
No, I'm going to talk for a while.
Okay,
but we can talk about moral standing or moral status and moral considerability. And there's different approaches to determining moral status or relative moral considerability. And one place people focus is capabilities. For example, some people say, but monkeys are intelligent and they're emotional and they're social and they're a lot like us, and so they have all the capabilities that we have that should justify giving them similar moral consideration to what we give people. And some people say, well, that's not really the relevant difference, capabilities. And some people don't have those capabilities. Some people are in, well, that's not, it's not a joke, but I'm referring to people in persistent vegetative states or people with severe cognitive impairments. And so we have the issue of what we call marginal cases. And so, but all marginal cases tend to get a pass. We still treat people with a very much moral consideration. They would still recognize their moral status, even if they lack some of those capabilities. So that's a tough puzzle. Or we say, no, what really matters is suffering and sentience, the ability to suffer, the ability to feel pleasure and enjoyment and pain. And so the different approaches to this question. But now I've set you up to give the crowd the answer.
Right. So my view on this is unformed in the sense that all the arguments that I see for the existing views all strike me as very bad. So I don't know exactly how to think through this issue. Rick just summarized some of the difficulties there. We have issues about moral status. Is moral status something that is a binary feature such that things who have it fully and things that don't have it don't matter at all? Or is it something that admits of degrees such that individuals can be sort of more morally important or less morally important but still have some degree of moral importance? It's very hard to defend the binary view, just because it seems like we do constantly draw these distinctions. To go back to the thought experiment or the case that Rick mentioned earlier, if I have to choose between running over a child and running over a mouse, I think I've got to run over the mouse. There's no other option. And it's not necessarily speciesist, because I think the same is true if it's a choice between a mouse and a monkey. I think I've got to run over the mouse. And the same is true if it's a mouse or a dog. I think I've got to run over the mouse. So it often is portrayed as being necessarily appealing to sort of the divine nature of humans, but that doesn't really have to be what's grounded here. The challenge, though, as Rick says, is that there are individuals who lack whatever it is that people think matters, and yet we still think it would be wrong to treat them as if they didn't have that value. And no view that I know of has sort of successfully answered that question about how do we justify the protections that there are for humans who lack all of these things that intuitively we think matter, but in this particular case, they lack.
How do the
But-
researchers here justify it? Is there a sort of a consensus of opinion about what makes a difference, or?
No, I think you'll get two different kinds of views, not necessarily from the same people, but so some people do take an explicitly speciesist view, and they say we're human, and they're not, and that's what justifies it. And then if you ask them, well, why does it matter so much that you're human? Well, because it does. Or they'll say, well, because humans have these capabilities. And then you respond, well, not all humans have those capabilities, and many non-human animals have those capabilities at least to a certain degree. Maybe they don't have all of them to the same degree that we have them, but they have them to a certain degree. And there, the discussion kind of falls apart. One thing that many people focus on here is the autonomy that humans are capable of. So many animals are capable of leading their lives in a certain way, making decisions and having preferences, but they don't seem to be capable to the same degree as at least a normal functioning human is in, for example, setting up an entire life plan where you can reflect on that, going back to sort of Rawls from the gentleman who's standing up there, having a life plan where you can say, you know, this is the way I want my life to go, you know, making plans for 30, 40, 50 years in the future, those kinds of things. But we come back to the marginal case problem. Not all humans have that capacity either, and we don't think that that means you can use them in research, and there it lies. So we got to draw some distinctions, I think. I think everybody should agree with that, but how to draw it in a way that avoids getting the wrong answers is an open question. One final comment on this, though. There's also, in addition to questions about moral status, there's also differences in the impact of various treatment on the interests of animals. So it's not that hard to explain why, for example, the death of an animal who only has a lifespan of 3 years is not as tragic as the death of an individual who would have lived another 40 years had they not been killed, and assuming that that life would have been filled with good, valuable experiences. So there we're talking about the interests that are frustrated by death, and many people would say that keeping a monkey in a cage frustrates many interests. They need to be justified. If they're not satisfactorily justified, it's wrong to do it. But the level of interest frustration pales in comparison to what it would be to keep you or I in a cage in terms of foregoing all kinds of valuable opportunities. So there's, in addition to the question of moral status, there's also the question of how are the different species of animals' interests impacted by the various treatment in question.
Because there's an assumption that we have to make decisions sometimes. We have to make trade-offs. Right? So there's a hierarchy of moral status or moral considerability. So ideally, we let the mouse live, the monkey live, right, the girl live, everybody lives, right? But there's this assumption that in the lab, there are trade-offs because we get something from the experiment. So if we forego the experiment's non-human animals, we're foregoing the opportunity to help people. And the degree to which we believe that depends on the answer to this empirical question. I tend to be skeptical. I think an awful lot of research doesn't benefit people, and so we don't have to make this trade-off. We don't have to invoke this hierarchy of moral considerability. But there's an assumption in research that we do.
I just wanted to add to this moral discussion because we talk so much about these capabilities that we often assume are positive, but I think if you're going to have this anthropomorphic view that humans are special by virtue of our rationality, you also have to take into account our capacity against other animals that we have a capacity for evil, or don't do things out of spite, or psychological egoism, as Spinoza would say. So I think, just to add to that moral conversation, we talk so much about these capabilities, but I think humans, in terms of running over a child or a mouse, you got to understand a mouse is just not going to have an evil impact on the world, and I think that's a considerable benefit and one worth taking into account. Versus a human, if you're going to say the human, they have a potential for being a serial killer, they have a potential for being a suicide bomber. You know what I mean? You have to take those things into account too.
I think that's a great point. I sometimes wonder what the elephants and bonobos and dolphins and chimps would think about our moral status. Now, chimps can be pretty violent. Bonobos are a lot more peace-loving. Dolphins are friendly. You know, what do they think? Why do we, as one species, how do we get to appoint ourselves as the arbiters of moral status for all members of all species? That strikes me as very arrogant, and it excludes this whole issue that we're not very good to others and members of other species, members of our own species, to the planet, to everybody's habitats. We're not very good at this stuff.
I think that's based on a confusion of the concept of moral status. So when individuals display depravity or criminal intent or those kinds of things, we deal with that through penal institutions. I mean, and we all have various criticisms of how effective and just those are, but we approach those in one way. But I would never say that somebody who's been arrested, for example, of a crime, thereby has a lower degree of moral status than the rest of us. So I don't think that moral status is sort of a virtue-based idea where the more virtuous you are, the more moral status you have, such that the virtuous people could exploit the unvirtuous people with justification. I think that a more egalitarian view is required. And in terms of pointing ourselves at arbiters, as arbiters of this, well, to not do the research is itself to make a decision to forego certain benefits. We have the ability to do it, and that forces on us this choice. There's no way to say, I'm just going to be morally neutral here, assuming that there really is a conflict of interest. So the empirical question aside. But it's not that we've forced ourselves to be arbiters. We have found ourselves in that position. And so to say now, well, I'm just going to wash my hands of it, I think, again, sort of like the Schweitzerian view, it's to basically ignore the conflict that is before us.
So kind of a little bit of that, you said you're against causing suffering to primates, really of any kind, or just animals of any kind. So by making that decision of foregoing the research, not doing the research, aren't you really, what's your perception on, by making that decision, you're also making the decision of causing suffering on the people who can benefit from that research, and this is just all different research, but what your perception is on, by making the decision to not conduct this research, you are then making the decision to harm or cause suffering or let the people that would benefit from the suffering benefit from the results of the research.
Well, first you're making an assumption about the so-called empirical question that I don't share. I'm much more skeptical of that. I'm not at all convinced that foregoing experiments in non-human animals would cause great harm to people. The second thing is we forego all kinds of things that have the potential to help people because we find them unethical, right? We don't think the Tuskegee syphilis study was ethical. We don't think the experiments on radiation of poor people in Cincinnati were ethical. We don't think the experiments on prisoners in Guatemala were ethical, or the Nazi experiments on Jews and gays and gypsy were ethical, right? And as a society in the United States now, we say we don't do those things because it's not ethical. So by not harming certain members of our population, we're foregoing benefits to others, right? So we shouldn't do that, right? We shouldn't forego harming some to help others. It comes back to the basic question of, is the species boundary morally significant? Does it make a difference? How big a difference does it make that we're people and they're not? And I have, as Rob said, that's not a really easy question to answer. What exactly conveys moral status? What exactly is the key difference between a monkey and me that says it's okay to experiment on the monkey? I don't know what that difference is. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, it really kind of goes to the utilitarian view. If, let's say, you were to, what really is the cost of the level of benefit by experimenting on, let's say, 10, you would be able to provide a benefit for 100, 200. But really, you just, as far as from my perspective, you see no, just absolutely, there's no really cost and benefit.
So what do you think of that scenario when we're just talking about people? We harm 10 people to help 100. Is that a good ethical, moral thing to do?
maybe not people, but not, and maybe not 100. But if you were to, let's say, well, but then let's go completely a little bit crazy. If there was an asteroid coming on Earth and 10 people had to get on the space shuttle in order to crash into the asteroid and explode it, which would save the Earth, what would be the ethical choice in there?
To let them choose. Let them choose. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate your question, but you see some of the difficulty with this. I think we're still stuck on the potential moral significance of the species boundary. Why does it make a difference that I belong to one species and they belong to another? Exactly why does it make a difference? Why should there be a different cost accounting? 10 people harmed to 100 people helped, that's not good enough. We need a higher ratio for harming people, a lower ratio for harming monkeys to help people. Why? Why?
If the experiment were involved mice, or snails, or rats, or snakes, would we be here discussing it?
I would.
Yep.
I would, sure, absolutely. For the same points that I'm raising. I don't.
Do you think it would arouse the same degree of concern among those people?
No, and that's a great point, because we tend to care more about those who are most like us. People first, family first, fellow citizens, right? It's this extension of self, and then fellow primates, right? It's extension of self. And then those animals we've domesticated and we keep in our homes, and dogs and cats. Lizards and what's the other one?
Hedgehogs.
Hedgehogs. But why? But the question is, from a moral perspective, if we want to have some rigor about the ethical moral frameworks we use, why should that be the case? How do we justify the difference in treatment?
In the Arab world, dogs are seen as filthy, unclean, terrible.
And in India, cows are sacred.
Right. And so, Rob, with your example, running over a mouse or a dog, an Arab might well pick the dog.
Sure.
So how much are we bound by culture in this discussion?
I think a lot.
I was going to say none. I never purported to be presenting a view that could convince every other person on Earth that my view was right. I'd have to hear a lot more about why it is that this individual thinks that dogs are filthy, and whether or not that was a reasonable view or not. I mean, they might change my mind. I think it's unlikely. But I might change theirs. I mean, right? So I was asked to give my view, and I did. And if you wanted to defend the view that dogs are filthy and worthy of being run over, then I would debate about that. But that's not your view either.
That's not my view. I thought 8:30 would be a good stopping point, but there's one hand left up. Should we take one more question? And call
Two hands
Two
left
hands.
up.
Okay, last two, please.
I would simple question. Do you disagree with military mobilization in the face of war, putting 10 at risk to benefit hundreds?
And causing harm to the other side in order to...
As a matter of principle, I like to stick to the topic of the evening. I haven't done a lot of thinking about that. I don't want to give an opinion off the cuff, but I would say just one quick thing. Somebody asked what we do if an asteroid's coming to Earth and you need 10 astronauts to go up. We live in an age of a voluntary military. We gave up the draft. People choose to join the military, and
Well, it's only voluntary in name here, I think. I mean,
well, there's some pressure, yeah.
But
otherwise, my focus is experiments on non-human animals, not military.
But I do think I mean, I don't want to press you on a view that you haven't really thought through, but it's relatively easy to say, oh, we should never harm others no matter the benefit. And it's easy to be consistent when that's your view. You just always decide in accordance with that. But what this question does show, is that has implications for lots of other kinds of activities that you might not really accept the implications for. The idea that it's, to take a sort of hackneyed example, if the only way to save my child is to kick you in the shins, I think I'm ethically required to kick you in the shins. Right?
Yeah, I think
that's harming you to help somebody else.
I think this is fair, and I wrestle at what I call the extremes a little bit too, and because an absolutist would have to say killing Hitler is wrong. killing anybody to save 1 million people is wrong. It's pretty hard to defend that position. And yet I still think it's worth wrestling with. I don't give in on that point easily. I think those are tough questions. One more question?
Well, not really a question, but so I work with people with disabilities. And so I believe that there are some animal experiments, maybe to help, some disabilities. Well, okay, in my field, what I come to believe is that, we find alternatives to help people in any way that you can. And I feel that science is supposed to find alternatives to reach, welfare of, all species, in an ideal world. With all these examples that's given, if it's a dog or a human, and there's one boat, and which one would you save? It's, everything is a matter of survival, although I would answer it depends on the human, like which one, it is to save. So I find that, all this hypothetical, survival, questions, it doesn't really apply with, this whole process, in science when, okay, let's do this experiment and hopefully we'll find some answers. I mean, it doesn't, I can't really find the connection between, what you said before about, maybe it's okay for one to suffer and in order to help 100 or thousands. You know what I mean? Because I don't see the urgency in that. When, scientifically you can actually find alternatives, that doesn't harm any animals. So.
Oh, okay.
So we haven't talked very much. I addressed a little bit in terms of the question from Dr. McConnell about alternatives in the context of the protocol that we've been referring to. Alternatives is an important aspect of the ethical thinking here. So even if the harms in an abstract sense are sufficient, even if the benefits are in an abstract sense sufficient to justify the harms, if the harms aren't necessary for achieving the benefit, then you no longer have a justification for the harms, assuming that the alternative is something morally preferable. So I think all sides agree that looking for more humane alternatives and looking for non-animal alternatives is important, and I think most people are at least willing to pay lip service. It's not clear exactly how committed they are, but are at least willing to pay lip service to the idea that we should do a better job funding the search for alternatives. The issue that confronts, I think, us with respect to many of the protocols that are under current public discussion and that are currently ongoing at UW are that alternatives are being used when they're available, but they're not always available. And if the insistence is that you have to look for an alternative before you can answer these scientific questions, then you're at least going to delay and possibly prevent somebody from actually ever addressing that question, because it may be that a non-animal way of answering that question never becomes available. So it's an issue about how long are we willing to wait, how much money are we willing to spend looking for these alternatives and those kinds of questions. We had Andrew Rowan here for a talk last year where he talked about computer chips that could do toxicology analysis much faster than most animal models can do. And I mean, if he's right, and I assume he is, well, that's great. And we'll use that now instead of animals for that particular thing. But that's one particular kind of toxicology test that he was looking at. He wasn't talking about psychology research and behavioral research and neuroscience. And so the problem right now, I think, or at least what forces the choice on us right now, is that scientists want to answer questions that we don't have those alternatives for.
Good. Rob, thanks a lot for doing this.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Rob.
That's great.
Yeah, well done. Thanks a lot for sharing your views on the experiment. Okay with that? Thanks for the water. You can meet
UW, so I've served on the Letters and Sciences Animal Care and Use Committee that oversees animal research taking place within Letters and Sciences. And then I'm also a member of what's referred to as the All-Campus Committee, and this sets campus-wide policy for the animal program here at UW. So I know a little bit about the book literature, but I also know a little bit about how things work in the actual day-to-day operations of the regulatory system.
Very good. So just a little bit more about me. Let's make this about me as much as possible. The thing I've done most in recent years is to teach college business courses, including at UW-Madison. I'm a lecturer at UW-Madison, the business school right now. I've taught at other schools too. Do some contract work in information technology, other things. I'm a part-time professional photographer, and I've written a couple books, some nonfiction, some creative writing. I have a bachelor's degree from Carleton College, a master's degree from Princeton University, and an MBA from UW-Madison. And my involvement in this whole issue goes back to 2004, when I started working to, really with the ultimate goal of ending experiments on monkeys. 2,000 monkeys are kept in cages at UW-Madison. Experiments are done on them. We may talk about that tonight. But that's been my focus in this part of my life for the last 8 or 9 years. So let's talk about ethical decision making. And Rob, I thought we'd start with a framework of utilitarianism, because the most common claim of that research on non-human animals is ethical relies on a utilitarian basis. So I thought we might start by defining utilitarianism and then seeing if we can apply it to a specific experiment and figure out how that experiment stacks up and how do we decide and can we tell, and just see where the conversation goes. So utilitarianism is about costs and benefits, and different formulations are that the most ethical action in utilitarianism is the one that maximizes the ratio of benefits to costs for all the relevant stakeholders, or that provides the greatest good for the greatest number. But you can probably do a better job with definitions of these things than I can. Can you say more to define it for us?
Sure, that's certainly in the right ballpark. And there are lots of different flavors of utilitarianism, or more broadly speaking, what's referred to as consequentialism, which says that the right action is the one that has the best overall consequences. Utilitarianism in its classical form is, as you say, it's a theory that says that you're morally required to do that which is going to have the best outcome with respect to maximizing utility, where utility is the word that the classical utilitarians use for sort of individual well-being. And so according to classical utilitarianism, what you're morally required to do in every situation is try to choose that action of the options that are open to you that maximizes the overall balance of positive well-being over negative well-being, benefits over harms. This is certainly the most common kind of justification that's given for animal research. And it's not uncommon for the researchers who do try to engage with the explicit ethics of what they do to say that they adopt a utilitarian framework, and that because they think that animal research in general, or a particular protocol, is sort of the best way to maximize the common good, that's why what they do is justified. And the language that you were saying earlier about our question that we're addressing about if and when is it ethical, I mean, the utilitarian defense would actually conclude with a stronger conclusion that not only is it ethical, where that just sort of means it's not wrong, it's okay to do, but that it's actually morally required, or at least morally laudatory. And if you talk to animal researchers on campus, I mean, they think that what they're doing is a noble part of the scientific enterprise, and it's going to improve the world in the ways that they think it is. And I mean, for them, the challenge is even sort of stopping to think, well, maybe there's anything wrong with what I'm doing or anything problematic about what I'm doing, when they see it as, their way to make the world a better place, and they're fulfilling that duty and obligation. One important aspect of utilitarianism is that it allows interpersonal trade-offs to justify an action. So on a utilitarian framework, harm to one individual, if that's the only way to bring about a greater benefit to another individual, then according to the utilitarian, that's not only justified, but in fact required. And it's very different from the way we normally think about interpersonal ethics when it comes to people, but many people do think it's the right way to think about our ethical obligations when it comes to animals.
So let's explore that a little bit, because to me it seems odd. When we're talking about research on non-human animals, we stand to get the benefits of it. Now, we can quibble. There may be some smaller benefits to the animals themselves, or to husbandry, or to living conditions. We talk about that occasionally. But primarily the purpose of experimenting, say on monkeys at Madison, is because we hope it's going to benefit people at some point.
Yeah, that's the primary purpose.
Right. So it seems odd to me, in a strange way of thinking about morality, that we do something that intentionally causes harm to others, and sometimes kills them, results in their deaths, because members of our group stand to benefit from it, at least potentially. And yet that's a utilitarian approach. If we knew in a utilitarian framework that a lot of people, if we had high confidence that a lot of people would benefit from relatively small harms to non-human animals, we'd have a moral obligation to cause that harm so that our group would get the benefits. Is that right?
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be our group. So, for example, I mean, this goes back to the qualifications that you mentioned. So we have veterinary research that takes place on campus where the benefits are to other animals of the same species. Some of that's clinical research, so taking place in the vet school where the actual animals who are the subjects of research might also benefit from a new experimental method. So it doesn't always have to be humans versus animals. We also do a lot of environmental and field research where we're looking at ways to protect the environment. Hopefully that will benefit to us eventually, but that's not sort of the proximate goal. But those exceptions aside, the thought is, in the minds of those who adopt a utilitarian justification for their work, is that the benefits to people are substantial. And when the harms to the animals are small enough and the numbers of animals are small enough and we have a sufficient degree of confidence that the research with animals is going to yield the benefits in question, and all those are things that we should talk about more. But right, when those circumstances are met, when those conditions are met, then it's the right thing to do. And to do otherwise, sort of playing devil's advocate here for the utilitarian, because I'm not actually a utilitarian, but to do otherwise would basically be saying that the interests of a smaller number and a smaller degree of harm is more important from a moral perspective than all of these people lined up who will be helped. And that seems to some people inegalitarian. So the most famous or perhaps infamous, depending on your view, utilitarian who's talked about animal research is Peter Singer. And he argues that the proper understanding of equality and the egalitarian ideals that most of us in this room probably hold dear commits us to thinking that the utilitarian way of thinking about things is right, because to do otherwise would be to essentially discriminate against those individuals who could benefit to a greater degree.
I think, as you pointed out already, this isn't how we make similar decisions about people. Now, in society, we make a lot of decisions that seem to be made on a utilitarian basis. But if we look for the same kind of, we try to conduct the same kind of experiments on people that we conduct on non-human animals, I don't think we'd ever make a utilitarian justification for it. We want to talk about a specific study in a little bit, perhaps. But an experiment that requires, say, a person to be confined in a cage from birth and given a disease or made to suffer brain damage or being on a restricted diet for the individual's whole complement, that is, and how great it would be if we all could listen that well my mind is open to hearing something new tonight and learning something new. I don't think my deepest held convictions are open to change tonight, but I'm here to learn something new and explore, and I hope you are too. I hope that we can all listen like Stephen Levitt did. So our focus for tonight is a simple question, simple on the surface. How should we decide if or when experiments on non-human animals are ethical? If or when, under what circumstances? The approach we're going to take is to review some commonly used frameworks for making ethical decisions and try to test their applicability to the issue of experiments on non-human animals. We might agree on some things, like I said, we may disagree, but our objective here is an argument, it is not debate, it's exploration. So I ask you to keep that word in mind. We're here to explore. After we've talked for a while, we're going to ask you for your comments and your questions, and then also ask you to participate with a spirit of exploration and focused on that question. How should we decide if or when experiments on non-human animals are ethical? And please note that a spirit of exploration doesn't mean we can't challenge each other a little bit. We want to challenge each other and try to go deep. Wittgenstein, old Austrian philosopher, wrote that the proper method of philosophy is to say only the things that allow themselves to be expressed. And he said that ethics does not allow itself to be expressed. In other words, according to Wittgenstein, there's nothing we can say about ethics. But we're going to try anyway and hope that it's worthwhile. So Rob, would you please introduce yourself?
Not as tall as you are. Hi, so I'm Robert Streiffer. I just want to second Rick's very eloquent remarks there. Even though he's a soft-hearted non-academic, he can apparently quote Wittgenstein with the best of them. That's not usual. This is definitely intended to be a discussion. We'll be looking at lots of different things from different perspectives, and I think it's very worthwhile to explore different perspectives even when we don't necessarily agree with them, because there's probably somebody in the audience who does hold something similar to that view, and it's helpful for them to think about the implications of their own frameworks for these things. I think with that, we can just get started.
Can you say a little bit more about your academic background and specialties?
Sure. So my disciplinary training is philosophy. I got my PhD from MIT in 1999, not too long ago, but a while ago, and started here at UW that same year, looked at ethics of modern biotechnology in general, and have shifted now to looking at the application of biotechnology to non-human animals, primarily as my research focus, and as sort of prerequisite to that, trying to understand the issues of animal use in general, so that I can better think about the application of biotech to them. As you mentioned, I've served on a few of the oversight committees here.
How good the sound is here. Looks like we do have to get pretty close to the mic. Shoot, I didn't want to do that. I'm Rick Marolt. This is Rob Streiffer. We'll introduce ourselves a little bit more formally in a little bit, but first thing I want to say is the most important thing to know about tonight is that this event is not a debate. If it were a debate, then it'd run the risk of being kind of lopsided, and I would have to set and manage your expectations more carefully than I'm going to. I would have to let you know that Professor Rob Streiffer here is well-known, well-respected, very accomplished tenured professor in bioethics who spends his life doing the bioethics in an academic way and also practicing as member of two animal research oversight committees. Such that last week I'm driving home from work and I hear a familiar voice on the radio and I go, oh boy, I know that voice. It's Rob Streiffer being interviewed by National Public Radio. Whereas I am just a soft-hearted guy who on a very part-time basis has been trying to work for the last few years to end or reduce some experiments on non-human animals at UW-Madison. But since this is not a debate, I don't have to tell you all that and set your expectations that way. What I have to do is tell you what this event really is. It's an experiment. It's an experiment to see if in this kind of format where two of us just get together and talk and have a conversation in public, which I think is not at all natural for either one of us, can contribute to the public discussion of some really important issues. And I think it's also an experiment to see if anything that we share can get past people's natural tendency to take in only the information that confirms the beliefs they already have, what we call biased interpretation or confirmation bias. And we're hoping that something we say, from whatever perspective, can get past the confirmation bias filters and maybe help people see something in a new way and learn something new. A few years ago, Stephen Levitt, the economist behind the team that co-wrote Freakonomics, a book that was all the rage for a while, was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. And the guy who wrote about him in the little blurb in Time was Malcolm Gladwell. And Gladwell described a debate that he had, public debate he had with Stephen Levitt. And he had this to say about it. Halfway through, I glanced over at Levitt and had a realization that I'm not sure I've ever had before with an intellectual opponent. That if I made my case persuasively and cogently enough, he would change his mind. He was, in other words, listening. I read that probably 6 years ago, and it's been in my mind ever since as the model of listening. And this is not a debate, but we're probably going to have some disagreement and view things in different ways. And you will view things in different ways. But I think what a wonderful